Thank you very much, Stefan, and thank you all for allowing me to say a very few words in closing. Um, I think the reason I travel around this country, to be quite honest, is not so much that my story is so unique. When we've been talking this morning about credentials, and people have talked about letters behind our name and so on and so forth, one of the parts of my presentations that I take the length and breadth of this country and workplaces across this country is that I don't have letter credentials behind my name. I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a social worker. And I think it's sort of my way of kind of explaining the way that if you don't like my presentation, blame it on that fact. But really what I want to establish in some way is the importance and the validity and the value add of lived experience. And so I toss out different credentials. What are my credentials? Why do I have the right to get up in front of anybody and speak about anything? And you know, it's in some ways a very long story, but the very, very, very short version is that I became severely ill in about 1983, ill to the point of, I like to call it, you know, the bus hitting the wall and all the wheels falling off. I had, in retrospect, been very sick for many years prior to that, but like so many of us who are stigmatized, not just by the world around us, but by our own self-stigma, our own shame and embarrassment, I had refused to acknowledge that anything was wrong with me. And so when I had the first of what ultimately became many, many breakdowns, in about 1983, that was, I guess, a turning point in my lived experience where I descended into almost true and complete madness. I was treated by 6 different psychiatrists, all of whom worked very hard to get me well. And by the time I ever went to my first psychiatrist, as you can imagine, this illness had not just pathologized to a certain extent in my brain, but had also taken hold of virtually every other part of my life, cognitively, emotionally, my relationships. I think in some ways it even seeped into my intellectual DNA. I was one of those folks, because the illness got more complicated, for whom initial and early medications simply did not work. And so I was tried on 27 different medications: antidepressants, mood stabilizers, antipsychotics, atypical antipsychotics, antiepileptics, anticonvulsants, and combinations of medications that the doctors like to call cocktails. I assure you bear no resemblance to a pina colada. I was treated in the worst of these episodes with 24 ECT treatments, electroconvulsive therapy treatments, a regimen that was very intrusive, very hard, very difficult, and I was treated with so many shock therapy treatments in such a short period of time that I was left like a stroke victim. I lost literacy, I lost numeracy. I couldn't add or subtract. I didn't know what the numbers on the telephone meant. And at the time, I was a senior policy analyst, making my living on my intellect. And so in addition to being the most hopeless, helpless, useless piece of crap on the shoe of humanity, I was also terrified that I would never again be gainfully employed. I learned a lot in that experience, and I want to share just one small anecdote because, and I apologize to my colleagues from this morning because it's the same one that I used in my self-introduction. I made 3 suicide attempts in the course of my history, and if you had me for a full hour, I would tell you how that parenthetically echoed exactly what happened with my own mother, who also attempted to take her life 3 times. And parenthetically, like my mother, it was my own daughter who found me on all 3 occasions. I was certified and certifiable on many occasions, and on one occasion I was confined to the psychiatric ward at North York General. I'd been admitted to the hospital on 17 different occasions. The shortest period of time, about 5 days, the longest period of time, close to 6 months. And as you know, even back in the 80s, certainly in the 90s, and certainly now, you didn't get admitted to the psychiatric ward of a hospital because you were having a bad hair day or the Leafs lost again. It was always a pretty serious event. I was on the ward at North York General, and I was just terrible. I was begging. I would beg my family. I would say to my family, you would never let an animal suffer. You would never let an animal suffer like you're letting me suffer. Why can't you just let me go? And I was enraged, and I was angry, and I was sobbing, and I was pleading just to be let go. And a nurse sat right beside me on the bed. And that alone was kind of interesting to me, because I don't recall before or after any nurse or any doctor sitting on the bed. And she sat beside me, and she put her hand over mine. And I'm not even sure what she said exactly. It wasn't a lot. I think it was just kind of kindness. But then she said something that just changed everything in a sense. She looked at me and she said, I know what you're going through, Karen. I've been where you are. And I looked in her eyes, and I saw something that I had never experienced. I saw her, but I also saw me in her. And it was like something opened up that said, you get it. You get it. There was no big long discussion. There was no big, big therapy session. But in that moment, I understood the concept of the simplicity of 2 words. Get it. You get it. I worked, believe it or not, I worked throughout all those years, and I would have a long flu a lot of the time. I had pre-SARS, I had flu like you wouldn't believe it. The flu. And people knew I was sick. People I worked with closely. Hundreds of others never knew a thing. But those closest to me knew that something was wrong. And they tiptoed and they walked on eggshells. And not one person in 15 years ever came up to me and said, I'm worried about you, Karen. Are you okay? Not one. And it wasn't because we didn't have wonderful working relationships. It wasn't because they weren't my friends. It wasn't because they were distant from me. It was because they didn't know what to say. They didn't know what my reaction would be. They didn't know if I'd be offended or hurt or angry. And so they said nothing. They said nothing. And for years and years, at the very place that helped define me, the workplace, the place that in many ways I actually felt safest, was in my workplace, because at least there I could accomplish something. In that very place, and in the social services. So not in big, bad, mean corporate Canada, in the social services. People were too afraid to say, Karen, I'm worried about you. How can I help you? What's wrong? What can I do to help you? I want to finish by using just a couple of analogies that, for me, speak to so much of what the leadership that's here, the peer leadership, the organizations that are thinking about this, that are deciding whether or not. Stefan said that my job was to take it to the lived experience level, what it's like, what it feels like, what it means, what it would have meant. And the analogy that I use is a very simple one. I don't know if any of you, I haven't done a lot, but I have done a little. Any of you traveled in a truly foreign country where nobody speaks the language? And it's a bit disconcerting when you really don't know the language and you're kind of, oh my gosh, I hope I don't, whatever. And you decide as a Canadian to wear that little Canadian flag pin, mainly because you don't want to be known as an American. Totally get that part. So you wear your little Canadian flag pin, and you're on a side street in Dubrovnik, and you come across someone who has the little Canadian flag pin. And all of a sudden, there's a connection made. All of a sudden, that little pin and that other little pin, oh, hi, you're from Canada. Yeah, where are you from? Winnipeg. Oh, Winnipeg, you're kidding. I have a second cousin once removed in Winnipeg. Maybe you know him. And it doesn't matter if they're from Winnipeg and you're from Ottawa. Somewhere in that little connection, in that little small space, it's a little bit of home. It's a little bit of comfort. It's a little bit of recognition. It's a little bit of, we're both in Dubrovnik. I have no idea how to say pizza, but you're here with me. You're here with me. You get it. When I do presentations across this country and I go into workplaces and I tell my story ad nauseam, and there'll always be a certain number of people who will put up their hands and ask questions. And then when it's all over, there's a snake line. They didn't put up their hand to ask the question, but there's a line, and they want to speak one-on-one to me. Not because I'm a counselor, not even because I'm a peer worker. It's not that. That's not why. Somewhere in my telling of my story, in them knowing that I'm wearing the little pin, they know that they can come up and talk to someone who's been there. And after we sort out standards of practice, certification, strategies, all kinds of things that we're going to work so hard on, that's what it comes down to. It comes down to that small, intimate connection that says, I get it. I've been there. Just before I went into my semi-retirement, my staff, well, they gave me 3 things. 1 was serious and 2 I don't think were serious. 1 was my very first piece of real technology called an iPad. And I opened it up yesterday, and I'm very proud of that. Nah, I'm an expert at it now. The second was an embroidered pillow that said, the Queen of Mood Swings. I thought that was nice. It's very pretty. And the last was a plaque. And the plaque said this: "Blessed art the cracked, for they let in the light." And I would suggest to you that for those of us who are and continue to be a little cracked, we may be those folks who upon connection, who upon recognition, who upon looking into someone's eyes, may be the folks to let in the light. Thank you. You've been very gracious.